The prestigious International Forum on African Development filled Boston's Grand Conference Center with diplomats, journalists, and political figures from across the globe. Thomas Reid adjusted his press badge nervously, scanning the crowd for his target. As the Chronicle's lead international correspondent, he had built his reputation on confrontational interviews with religious political figures, and today presented his biggest opportunity yet. Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader, who had risen to become president of Burkina Faso, stood surrounded by attendees near the east entrance. Despite his military background, Traoré had surprised international observers with his eloquent speeches on sovereignty and his nation's right to chart its own path. His open references to faith in governance had made him a polarizing figure in Western media. "There he is," whispered Emma Chen, Thomas's editor. "Remember, we need something provocative. His comments about implementing faith-based policies have our readers concerned. Get him to admit the contradiction between religious governance and democratic principles." Thomas nodded, checking his recorder. He had researched Traoré extensively, preparing questions designed to expose what he considered dangerous religious influence in politics. As a vocal atheist with a popular column on the separation of church and state, Thomas saw this as more than an assignment. It was a moral imperative. He approached as the crowd around Traoré momentarily thinned. "President Traoré, Thomas Reid. With the Chronicle, might I have a moment of your time?" Traoré turned, his expression calm and appraising. He was younger than Thomas expected, with intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate the journalist in an instant. "Mr. Reid, yes, I've read your work." This unexpected acknowledgement momentarily threw Thomas off balance. "You have? Your piece questioning religious influence in West African governance was interesting." Traoré's English was precise, his tone neutral. "Though I found your understanding of our cultural context somewhat limited." Thomas recovered quickly, gesturing toward a quieter corner. "Perhaps you could enlighten me then. Your recent implementation of policies inspired by religious principles has raised concerns about democratic representation in a diverse society. How do you justify imposing faith-based governance on citizens who may not share your beliefs?" Several nearby journalists paused their conversations, sensing the confrontational tone. Traoré, however, showed no sign of discomfort or defensiveness. "An interesting framing, Mr. Reid." Traoré's voice remained measured, but it contains assumptions worth examining. "You speak of imposing and faith-based governance as if these are self-evident descriptions of our policies. Your own speeches reference divine guidance in decision-making," Thomas countered. "Surely in the modern world, governance should be based on reason and evidence rather than religious texts?" The room had grown quieter now, more attention turning toward their exchange. Thomas felt a surge of confidence. This was exactly the kind of provocative moment his editor wanted. Traoré considered him for a moment before responding. "Mr. Reid, have you ever visited Burkina Faso?" The question wasn't what Thomas expected. "No, I haven't had that opportunity." "Perhaps that explains the fundamental misunderstanding in your question." Traoré's gaze was direct but not unkind. "You present a false dichotomy between faith and reason, as if they must exist in opposition. This perspective reveals more about Western secular assumptions than about governance itself," Thomas pressed forward. "But when leaders make decisions based on religious beliefs rather than empirical evidence, who says these are mutually exclusive?" Traoré interrupted, his voice still calm but with newfound intensity. "The assumption that faith precludes rational thought is itself an ideological position, not a neutral stance. In my country, we do not see our spiritual understanding and our rational faculties as adversaries." The response silenced Thomas momentarily. It wasn't defensive or evasive. It challenged the very premises of his questioning in a way he hadn't anticipated. Nearby, a young woman named Amina Johnson, a graduate student in international relations, quietly recorded the exchange on her phone. This unexpected philosophical turn would soon circulate widely across social media, forcing conversations that neither man could have anticipated. "I would suggest," Traoré continued, noting Thomas's silence, "that perhaps the most dangerous, Ideology is the one that doesn't recognize itself as ideology, that mistakes its cultural assumptions for universal truths. For the first time in his journalistic career, Thomas Reid found himself without a ready response, the recorder still running between them as the implications of Traoré's words began to register. The video of Thomas Reid's encounter with Ibrahim Traoré went viral within hours. Silenced by Truth became the top trending hashtag as millions watched the American journalist momentarily speechless before the Burkina president's measured response. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Emma fumed in her Boston office the next morning, pacing before the wall of screens displaying social media reactions. "You were supposed to expose his religious influence, not become a showcase for his philosophical prowess." Thomas stared at his own face frozen on the central screen, his expression caught between confusion and unexpected introspection. His response wasn't what I anticipated. He didn't defend religious governance. He challenged my entire framing of the issue. "The Chronicle's reputation is at stake," Emma insisted. "We need a follow-up that reclaims the narrative. Your column goes out tomorrow. Frame this as Traoré using philosophical sleight of hand to avoid accountability." But as Thomas left the Chronicle building, doubts lingered. Traoré's words had struck a chord he couldn't easily dismiss. "The most dangerous ideology is the one that doesn't recognize itself as ideology." Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, some supporting Traoré, others criticizing him. Among them stood Amina Johnson, the graduate student who had recorded the exchange. Recognizing Thomas, she approached. "Your interview raised important questions," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Amina Johnson. My dissertation examines cross-cultural epistemological frameworks in international relations." "Meaning? How different cultures determine what counts as valid knowledge," she explained. "President Traoré articulated something my research has been highlighting, that Western secularism often presents itself as neutral when it's actually a specific cultural position." Thomas bristled. "Are you suggesting that faith-based governance is equally valid to evidence-based policy?" "I'm suggesting the dichotomy itself might be flawed," Amina replied, "and that understanding Traoré requires looking beyond Western frameworks. I grew up in Burkina Faso before coming to the States. The relationship between spirituality and governance there is more nuanced than American media portrays." Later, that evening, Thomas's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. "Mr. Reid, I believe our conversation was left unfinished. Perhaps we could continue it before I return to Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré." Thomas stared at the message, torn between journalistic opportunity and professional caution. Emma would expect him to use this opening for a more aggressive confrontation. But something had shifted in him, a crack in certainty that had defined his career. On his laptop, his half-written column condemned Traoré for philosophical evasion. Yet the president's words continued to resonate, challenging assumptions Thomas had never before questioned. With unexpected resolve, he deleted the draft and began again, typing a title that would surprise his readers and infuriate his editor. "What if we're asking the wrong questions?" Reflections on faith, reason, and cultural bias. Across town in his hotel suite, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed briefing documents while waiting for Thomas's response. Unlike most Western journalists who approached him with thinly veiled hostility, he had sensed something different in Thomas. Not just antagonism, but genuine, if misguided, conviction. "Mr. President," his aide said, entering with a tablet, "the American journalist's initial article has been published, but it's not what we expected." Traoré took the tablet, reading Thomas's surprisingly reflective piece, questioning his own. Cultural assumptions rather than attacking Traoré's governance. A slight smile crossed his face as he received Thomas's response to his invitation. "I'd welcome the opportunity to continue our conversation. There are questions I should have asked instead." Neither man realized that their upcoming conversation would catalyze a dialogue extending far beyond two individuals or two nations, challenging entrenched narratives on both sides of the Atlantic. The cafe in Cambridge overlooked the Charles River, its quiet atmosphere perfect for the conversation that would reshape Thomas Reid's understanding of the world. Ibrahim Traoré sat across from him, steam rising from his untouched tea as he listened to Thomas's unexpected admission. "I've built my career on challenging religious influence in politics," Thomas said, "but your question about ideology not recognizing itself, it's haunted me these past days." Traoré nodded. "Western secularism often presents itself as neutral, the absence of ideology rather than a specific worldview. Yet all frameworks for understanding reality involve unprovable assumptions." "Still," Thomas countered, "empirical evidence is interpreted through cultural lenses," Traoré finished. "In Burkina Faso, our approach to governance acknowledges spiritual dimensions of reality while embracing rational analysis. These aren't contradictions in our understanding." Their conversation flowed beyond rehearsed talking points, exploring how Traoré's policies focused on community resilience, environmental stewardship, and sustainable development reflected both practical needs and deeper values rooted in his culture's worldview. "The Western press portrays my references to faith as theocratic impositions," Traoré observed, "and yet they miss how these spiritual foundations actually support policies promoting pluralism and scientific advancement. We reject the false choice between tradition and progress." As afternoon light shifted across the river, Amina joined them, bringing perspectives from her research on epistemological frameworks across cultures. The conversation deepened, challenging Thomas's assumptions not through confrontation but through genuine dialogue. "The narrative about African leadership is so often distorted," Amina noted. "Stories about religious influence become shorthand for dismissing governance models that don't fit Western paradigms." Thomas found himself taking notes, not for a gotcha article, but for a deeper understanding. "My readers have certain expectations about my column," he admitted. "Challenging religious influence in governance has been my brand." "Perhaps your readers deserve more nuance," Traoré suggested. "Not abandoning critical thinking, but applying it to your own assumptions as rigorously as to others." When they parted hours later, Thomas felt fundamentally altered, not in his core values of truth and justice, but in his understanding of how cultural context shapes what counts as valid knowledge. His column the next day would disappoint those expecting another takedown, offering instead reflections on epistemological humility and the limitations of his own perspective. What none of them anticipated was how that column would catalyze conversations across America, challenging the simplified narratives about African governance and the relationship between faith and reason in the modern world. 3 months after his encounter with Ibrahim Traoré, Thomas Reid stood before a crowded lecture hall at Harvard Kennedy School. His talk, "Beyond Secular Religious Divides, Rethinking Governance Frameworks," had drawn an audience that spilled into the aisles. "My career was built on certainty," he began. "I approached questions of faith and governance with unwavering conviction that secular rationalism represented neutral, objective truth, while religious frameworks were inherently biased." President Traoré challenged that certainty with a simple observation that perhaps the most dangerous ideology is the one that doesn't recognize itself as ideology. On screen behind him, footage played of their initial confrontation, the moment that had transformed from professional embarrassment into profound catalyst. Thomas had expected backlash from his readers when he began exploring these questions. In his column, instead, he found hunger for nuanced dialogue crossing traditional political lines. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the latest transcript of Thomas's lecture series, smiling at how their conversation had evolved beyond two individuals to impact discourse in both nations. His own approach to governance had gained unexpected defenders in Western academic circles, while at home, his administration's integration of traditional wisdom with contemporary challenges had become a model studied across West Africa. The diplomatic reception that evening brought together scholars, journalists, and policymakers from across the political spectrum. Amina Johnson, now completing her dissertation with Thomas as a case study, facilitated discussions on epistemological frameworks in international relations. The binary between faith-based and evidence-based governance reveals more about Western cultural assumptions than about governance itself, she explained to an attentive group. President Traoré's approach demonstrates how spiritual foundations can actually strengthen scientific inquiry and pluralistic policy development when not artificially separated. Thomas, watching from across the room, marveled at how his professional identity had evolved. His column remained dedicated to truth and accountability, but with newfound appreciation for cultural context and epistemological humility. Rather than abandoning critical thinking, he had deepened it by turning that critical lens on his own assumptions. The Chronicle's readership had initially been divided by his transformation, with some accusers crying betrayal while others welcomed the more nuanced approach. Gradually, his exploration of how different cultures determine valid knowledge had drawn a devoted following transcending traditional political lines. "Your work has changed considerably," noted Eleanor Harlow, a senior State Department official who had approached Thomas at the reception. "There's growing interest in your framework for cross-cultural dialogue in our diplomatic training programs." "The credit belongs to President Traoré," Thomas replied. "He could have dismissed me as just another hostile Western journalist. Instead, he engaged with the assumptions behind my questions rather than the questions themselves." Later that evening, a video call connected Cambridge to Ouagadougou, where Traoré joined the discussion remotely. The technology bridged continents, allowing dialogue between perspectives once considered fundamentally opposed. The challenges facing our world, climate crisis, technological disruption, economic inequality, require integrating diverse knowledge systems, Traoré observed to the gathered audience. "When we recognize that all frameworks for understanding reality involve unprovable assumptions, we can engage across differences without demanding others abandon their foundational perspectives." The quarterly forum they had established, bringing together African and Western thinkers to explore governance questions beyond traditional secular religious divides, had expanded beyond academic circles to influence policy discussions in both regions. Thomas's latest book project, Silenced by Truth: How an African President Changed My Understanding of Knowledge, had drawn interest from publishers worldwide. It wasn't the book he had once imagined writing, exposing religious influence in governance, but something more profound, an exploration of epistemological humility and cross-cultural understanding. As the video call concluded, Traoré addressed Thomas directly. "Our initial encounter could have reinforced divisions. Instead, it became a bridge. Not because either of us abandoned our perspectives, but because we recognized them as perspectives rather than universal truths." Thomas nodded, remembering his momentary speechlessness during their first meeting, not as professional failure, but as the pause that precedes transformation, the silence that makes new understanding possible. The Harvard audience applauded as the call ended, but the conversation it represented continued, spreading across campuses, policy centers, and media outlets on both continents, challenging simplified narratives and creating space for more nuanced engagement across the divides that had long seemed unbridgeable. In that unexpected resonance between a Western journalist and an African president, something profound had been demonstrated: that meaningful dialogue across deep divisions wasn't merely possible, but essential to addressing the complex challenges of their interconnected world.